Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. Yes, today we are continuing our ongoing coverage of the war between the Russian Federation and the Ukraine. Now, I have talked repeatedly about the process of escalation within this war. I've talked about eventually the war will bring in other nation states. Other nation states are actively participating. Russia is not just fighting the Ukrainians. They are also fighting Western allied nations who are supporting the Ukrainians. Now, just a year ago, it would have been inconceivable that the United States, that the United Kingdom, France, would hand over some of its most advanced weapon systems that could strike deep inside the Russian Federation. Again, this is not like the Ukrainians using its own weapon systems, its own developed weapon systems to strike at Russia. These systems that are being handed over now that will very soon strike or try to strike deep inside the Russian Federation come directly from the United Kingdom, come directly from the United States. They are entering Ukrainian territory from Poland, from Romania, and other Western allied NATO nation states. At what point does Russia say, enough? You, Poland, by allowing these weapon systems into Ukraine, are directly participating in the conflict. You have become a combatant participant. Then what happens? Again, the whole concept of escalation is happening gradual. Very gradual. One day it would be outside the realm of possibility that the United States would hand over the ATACMS. It would not be possible for France and the United Kingdom to hand over the Storm Shadow and Storm Shadow-like missile systems. I think we're reaching a point that it would not be outside the realm of possibility that actual NATO assets, French fighter aircraft that have the capability of launching Storm Shadow, cross into Western Ukraine, and then launch their weapon systems. I would say it is possible that has already happened. So again, go back to the beginning of the conflict. And it was often talked about in the Western media. It was incredibly unlikely that the United States would hand over these weapon systems to the Ukrainians, as it could spark a wider war. Then certain weapon systems were handed over to the Ukrainians with the stipulation that they could only be used by attacking targets in areas of eastern Ukraine that the Russians were operating. Now, the United Kingdom, the UK, has announced that it would be perfectly acceptable for the Ukrainians to launch Storm Shadows against targets deep inside the Russian Federation. It's probably already occurred, but now it's going to be just a common thing. It'll become a common occurrence. The ATACMS, same situation. In all likelihood, we'll start to see those systems being used against targets deep inside the Russian Federation. Now, what's interesting is we've seen a recent attack by Ukrainian forces. The Ukrainians alleged that it was an ATACMS that struck a target. I believe it was in Donetsk and or Luhansk, and that system was a cluster munition. It was not a unitary warhead. It was a cluster warhead that drops dozens of small bomblets over a fairly wide area. And they alleged to have killed up to 100 Russian soldiers in that attack. Now, what's interesting is I had the opportunity to watch that aforementioned video, that attack. And you can see that indeed a cluster munition was used, what looks to be on troops in the open, in a field. Now, how they are getting that casualty estimate, it's difficult to say. I mean, obviously they could count that there was a company-sized element of Russian forces in that field. But the problem is after the weapon system is used, and you can clearly see that it did impact where those troops were at their location. But it's difficult to say what the actual casualty numbers were in that specific attack. Because after the attack, you can even see troops running away. And cluster munitions, depending on the type of terrain that they're being used in. Look, terrain looks very flat when you're looking through a drone optic. But if there's any sort of areas that are in defilade with rolling hills, it becomes much more difficult, and the lethality of these cluster munitions are much less in some of those areas. And also you have to look at the types of soil in the area. There are a lot of things that come into play when trying to ascertain how lethal a strike was. But to say that that entire company-sized element was KIA'd, they're really reaching on that one. Because we know, just from seeing the video, you can see people running away. You can see soldiers, if they were Russian soldiers, you can see them trying to run and get away. So that means, obviously, not all of them were killed, and possibly some were killed, possibly some were wounded. But to say 100 of them were KIA'd, I think, again, they're kind of reaching. But that's an example of that one ATACMS strike that will probably see the Ukrainians attempt to try to use these systems against targets deep inside of Russia. Now, the problem for the Ukrainians is the Russians are learning to shoot these systems down fairly quickly. We know that there have been other ATACMS strikes against fairly sensitive targets in places such as the Crimea and other areas, and we know that some of those strikes were very ineffective. And the reason they were ineffective is the Ukrainians were trying to attack a sensitive target, and there was a very robust air defense system or air defense network located in that area that they were trying to strike. probably covered by S-400s. Eventually, the Russians will replace some of those S-400s with S-500s. There is a system, a medium-range system within the S-500 that the Russians are developing. I mean, obviously, the S-500 is notorious for being a long-range system. But again, the Russians are continuing to adapt and modernize and create new systems for these S-400s and S-500s. Remember, the S-400, the S-500, the S-300 is just not one missile. There are a multitude of missiles that are launched from these systems. And what we're starting to see is the Russians are shooting these systems down. They're shooting down the Storm Shadow. They're shooting down the ATACMS. Even the Ukrainians themselves are saying, hey, look, we probably have about 2 months to use these systems deep inside of Russia to try and strike sensitive targets inside of Russia before the Russian air defense network just becomes too robust. Meaning whatever we fire at a sensitive target, a command post, whatever they're trying to target, is going to be intercepted by the Russian air defense network. I believe that's why you saw the Ukrainians use the ATACMS with that cluster warhead against those troops in that open field. And I would wager that because they used them against forces that were not too far from the line of contact, just a couple of dozen miles at the most from the line of contact, that means they were trying to use the ATACMS in an area where they knew that the Russian air defenses were not as robust. So that's probably why you saw the Ukrainians attack that infantry company in the field. That's not something you would ordinarily see the Ukrainians expend such a very costly, very advanced weapon system against some reserve soldiers training in a field. But that's what occurred. And again, the probability is because the effectiveness of those strikes, of those ATACMS strikes, those Storm Shadow strikes, are becoming they're getting intercepted by the Russians, and they're not able to hit targets by penetrating that Russian air defense network with those systems. Now, that's not to say that we'll see the Ukrainians fire the ATACMS, fire the Storm Shadow against civilian infrastructure inside of the Russian Federation. That's been happening, and we'll probably see it happen again and again. But some of these more sensitive targets inside of Russia are very well defended, and it's very difficult to send enough missiles at these targets to where they penetrate Russian defenses and are effective in those strikes. But again, it just shows you what is happening and how the conflict continues to escalate. Now, you're also hearing the French talking about sending troops into Ukraine to become active participants in this conflict. And believe me, it would not surprise me at all if the French do in fact send in forces and we eventually see this conflict escalate, meaning we see Russian forces directly attack French forces. Or there a report of French forces that are operating in some kind of capacity, training capacity in western Ukraine, that are killed by a Russian ballistic missile strike or cruise missile strike. That's probably already happened, but it's just not being reported. Now, at some point, if the West really wants to seek intervention, they will start reporting that they are losing soldiers in the ongoing conflict, meaning the Russians have struck a training depot in which French soldiers or possibly soldiers of the United Kingdom were operating in western Ukraine. They're there. They're operating there. There are U.S. forces as well in western Ukraine. CIA, clandestine groups of U.S. Special Operations Forces operating in Western Ukraine. They're there. Now, will the Russians start targeting those sites and those individuals? Quite possibly. It's coming. It's going to happen. Again, the whole concept that this conflict is going to continue to escalate and get worse and spread is very, very possible and highly likely. It is more likely that this war, again, is going to expand and involve other nation states. It's the normal course in terms of war if you look back at human history. Look at World War I. Look at how World War I started. Again, not because of an immediate declaration of war. It had more or less of a cascading effect. This happened, followed by this happened, followed by this. And that's probably what we're going to see within the confines of this conflict. It's spreading slowly. It continues to escalate. More and more weapon systems are being used, especially weapon systems that are being handed over to the Ukrainians. The rhetoric is becoming more intervention-minded, meaning the French looking to directly inject forces into the conflict. And then there you have it. Furthermore, the Russians continue its breakthrough to the northwest of Avdiivka. Just a quick map check to see what has happened over the course of the last few days. And you can see this is a legitimate breakthrough northwest and southwest of Avdiivka. And there it is. And that attack's going to continue. We're also seeing a massing of Russian troops that is occurring in this area, Zavtova. There are reports that up to 4 Russian divisions are massing in this area. And what it looks like the Russians could be preparing for is a very large offensive operation in the direction of the Escalate River. And what they're probably looking to do is cut off Ukrainian forces that are operating along the front line here with their backs to these large terrain features. And if the Russians are able to start large-scale maneuver warfare and retake this area, this would be a great benefit to the ongoing Russian war effort. All this area at one point was controlled by the Russians. And we saw that Ukrainian counterattack in which they were able to retake a lot of this territory. Now the dynamics of the conflict are changing. Just last month, in the month of April, we know now, again, over 1,000 aim points were hit by GLONASS-guided glide bombs. The Ukrainians have taken appalling casualties in the course of those 1,000 strikes. Massive casualties. And that's continuing. The use of Russian glide bombs, as I've talked about before, is only going to increase. We're going to see, instead of 1,000 aim points being hit last month, we'll eventually see 2,000 aim points being hit. That's the scale of Russian production. The Russians are scaling up this conflict. As I've talked about before, they've taken the gloves off. So that's where we set for today. More to come very, very soon as we continue to cover the conflict. Thank you for joining us. As always, Have yourself a good day.